All right, you Brits out there, take your grubby mitts off our tea. Do you even know why we're here? Because of your King George II. When he passed a series of tax reforms in the 1760s and 70s, they sparked a small colonial revolt over here in the North American colonies, which you might have heard of. It's called the American Revolution. Let me explain how it all kicked off. You see, King George II was always looking for ways to make more money for his mother country, Great Britain, and so he started passing all these taxes. But the colonists were like, dude, we're already taxed to death. We pay all the money. See, for hundreds of years before this, the colonies had been pretty much left alone to do their own thing with very few taxes. But now he wanted to change that, and the colonists were not having it. It was a classic story of an empire trying to raise revenue from its distant colonies, only for those colonies to be like, no thanks. We'll start our own country instead. The first tax he passed was the Sugar Act in 1764, which raised taxes on sugar and molasses imported into the colony. The colonists had gotten used to smuggling sugar in from the French and Spanish because those were our rivals at the time. And so by putting heavy taxes on that, the king was ruining the market for smuggled goods. So colonists took to smuggling even more and bribing British officials to look the other way when they shipped in the good stuff. So to combat this, the British government passed the infamous Stamp Act in 1765. Remember the Sugar Act? Well, the Stamp Act put a tax on pretty much every piece of paper. In the colonies, they had to put a stamp on legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, playing cards, dice. Anything you bought had to have one of those stamps on it to show that you paid the tax. The colonists were pissed. They weren't represented in Parliament. You can't tax us without representation. So they began boycotting British goods. They dumped East India Company tea into the Boston Harbor. They rioted. And eventually the king backed down. He repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, but he kept the Sugar Act and added even more taxes with the Acts of 1767. These included taxes on things like glass, tea, paper, and paint. The colonists were once again boycotting British goods and things were heating up. Then in 1770, it boiled over. It was a Boston massacre. Things had been escalating between the British soldiers stationed in Boston and the local colonists. The tension built until one night some heckling colonists threw snowballs and other things at the guards outside the customs house where many of the tax collectors worked. The guards then opened fire on the crowd, killing 5 colonists. The whole thing was blown out of proportion and turned into a huge propaganda scandal that made the king look bad and made the colonists even angrier. Now, a few years later, things were still tense. The British government passed the Tea Act of 1773, which gave the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. Now, while the actual price of tea didn't go up, the colonists saw this as another power grab by the king. And on December 16, 1773, a group of colonists snuck onto 3 ships carrying East India Company tea, docked in the Boston Harbor and dumped 92,000 pounds of it into the water. It was the Boston Tea Party. The king was furious and he wanted revenge. He punished Massachusetts with the coercive or intolerable acts, depending on what you want to call them. These acts closed the port of Boston until the colonists paid back to East India Company for the destroyed tea. They also revoked the Massachusetts Charter and placed the colony under direct control of the British government. They also passed a law that allowed British officials to be tried in England rather than in the colonies. And they quartered British troops in private homes. Other colonies began to rally around Massachusetts. They called a Continental Congress in 1774 to coordinate resistance to the intolerable acts. Delegates from every colony except Georgia met in Philadelphia to discuss their response. Most wanted to avoid war with Britain, but agreed that the intolerable acts needed to be repealed. They sent a petition to the king, but he wouldn't budge. In April 1775, a British general got wind that the colonists were planning to seize 2 large caches of weapons stored in the towns of Lexington and Massachusetts. On April 18th, 800 British soldiers set out to seize the weapons. they were met by 700 Minutemen, local militiamen, who were ready to fight. At Lexington, British soldiers fired on the Minutemen, killing 8. Then they continued on to Concord, where they found most of the stores abandoned as they were leaving town. However, they were attacked by 400 more Minutemen and had to retreat to Boston. That retreat became known as the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and is considered the first battle of the American Revolution. Within days, the Continental Army had surrounded Boston. British General William Howe tried to escape, but his fleet was driven away by the Continental Navy. The siege of Boston would continue for another year, but it was clear that the British couldn't win a war on two fronts. They evaded Boston in March 1776 and headed south to New York. By this point, it was clear that reconciliation with Britain wasn't going to happen. On July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson. It outlined the reasons for the break between the colonies and Britain, including King George's refusal to acknowledge the colonies' right to self-government. It was a long document filled with lots of big words. Here's the basic idea. King George II, you're fired. Over the next 8 years, the ragtag Continental Army led by General George Washington would fight the mighty British Empire to a bloody draw. Foreign powers like France and Spain got involved, and ultimately the Americans won. With the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the United States of America was officially recognized as an independent nation. So there you have it. That's how taxes, tea, and tyrannies sparked a nation. I'm your host, and remember, don't forget to be awesome.